Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dennis Schuler. I'm the host of Wendepunkt, Inflection Points of Senior Leaders. I'm taking a little bit of a detour today away from the normal business leaders I speak to talk with one of the noted academicians, a faculty member at the University of Alabama who's taught more than 52 years. His name is Ron Dulek, and I'll bring Ron on in just a minute here. By way of background, Ron is the John R. Miller Professor of Management at the University of Alabama. Ron has published 9 books in his career, more than 50 academic journal articles in the areas of business, business strategy, and business communication. One of his books, The Elements of Business Writing, spent over a year in the best-selling list of both Prentice Hall, Macmillan, and other publishing companies. His 9th book, Sitting with Elephants, which was published in August of 2020, was listed as Amazon's #1 seller on South African travel. Ron is also a recipient of the Kitty O. Locker Outstanding Researcher Award, the Association for Business Communications' highest research honor. Now, as a devoted teacher, Ron has been selected MBA Teacher of the Year, get this, 23 different times, and the EMBA Teacher of the Year 19 times. Other awards recognizing his devotion to students include the National Alumni Association's Outstanding Commitment to Teaching Award, the Thomas D. Moore Outstanding Undergraduate Teacher Award, the Penny Allen Award for Outstanding Commitment to Students Award, and the University of Alabama's Athletic Department's Outstanding Faculty Award. The honor with which Ron is most pleased, however, is his selection by Alabama's senior class as the inaugural speaker for the university's last lecture program, something we're going to cover a little bit later in our webcast. He's also a recipient of the Algernon Sidney Sullivan Award, the university's highest faculty honor. National and international organizations with which Ron has worked extensively include ADTRAN, AT&T, Chevron, IBM, Kimberly-Clark, Mercedes, OSHA, Spire, Stora Enso, and Volvo. And for the last 3 years, Ron has consulted regularly with the cabinet and ministers of the Tanzanian government. He's also a member and past chair of the Alabama Credit Union Board and has served on various local other boards, including the West Alabama Red Cross and the YMCA. Ron enjoys international travel and delivered multiple research and business presentations in the following locations over the last 5 years. This is like he's got a travel map, I think, in his briefcase. Belgium, China, South Africa, Germany, Ireland, Sweden, Finland, Latvia, Singapore, Namibia, and Zanzibar. Ron and his wife, Sally, reside 10 months a year in Northport, Alabama, and 2 months a year in a nature preserve in Sabi Park, South Africa. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, because that was the genesis for the book I mentioned, which is Sitting with Elephants. So with that, let me welcome my friend, my colleague, Ron. Welcome to Wendepunkt, Inflection Points for Senior Leaders. Thanks for being with us today. And I'm joined today by Ron Dulek, who is a preeminent professor at the University of Alabama. Notice the colors I'm wearing today.
I debated doing that myself, Dennis, but I thought it might be overkill.
Yeah, that's only for you, Ron.
Well, thank you.
My wife said, "What are you wearing that sweater for?" I thought you didn't like it because I don't like red that much or crimson. And I said, "I got Ron today, so what can I say?"
Man, well, you look good in it.
Well, thank you. Old dogs sometimes can get polished up a bit. So, what I'd like to start with is you've been teaching over 50 years, and you've had a distinguished career. I was wondering if we go back to talk about what drew you to academia to start with, and what were your early influences that took you that pathway as a profession, as an occupation?
I've thought about that a lot over the years, and I'm going to give you kind of 2 different answers. One answer is that, and this sounds very kind of pro-academics and pro-American, but my dad dropped out of school when he was in 8th grade, and my mom graduated from high school. And I see education as the great equalizer. I didn't, what happens when you grow up in kind of a lower middle class family, sometimes you don't see all the opportunities that are out there, but you always see the opportunity in education because you're there.
Yeah.
And so you see that opportunity, and so it was kind of natural to go in that direction because I saw the opportunity there. The other issue, the other answer though, is that I quickly found, I discovered that I was pretty good at it. And
That always
so
helps.
I think that helps. And it's something that I, over the years have said to students, everybody, when the standard undergraduate comes to you and says, I don't know what to do with my life, the standard counter question is, well, what do you enjoy doing? Well, the truth is I enjoy doing golf, but I'm not very good at it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a really good answer. What I answer instead is, what skills do you have? What are you good at? And if you're good at something and you succeed, then you start to like it. The truth is I sort of like golf, but I get really frustrated at golf because of my incompetence. And so why try and build a career there versus building a career in a skill set in a location that as you do well, you succeed, you start to like it.
Yeah.
And so that's, so it was a combination of not knowing what the other opportunities are with getting rewarded by doing well. And so you kind of keep going in that direction.
Yeah, I had the same. I had the same start. I remember vividly, and I think it was 6th or 7th grade. I go back that far. In wood shop, you had to cut a block of wood into a certain angle, and then you had also you had a written test to do alongside it. Well, I got 100 on the written test, and I got like a D- on the block cut. And I go, okay, I know my life is not going to be with my hands; it's going to be up here. So I better get cooking on the books.
That was exactly the same thing, Dennis. I actually have a little dog that I did in wood shop that my mother hung on the wall, but the grade on the back is D+. Only a mother would like that.
Yeah,
that dog.
That's right. They keep everything, but it's at least
They keep everything.
It was kind of embarrassing. I said, I think I know what I want to do with my life. And, listen, for me, the Pell Grant back now, I don't know if you took advantage of that. I was a lower middle class too, but that Charlie Pell Grant, that really helped because my parents actively dissuaded me of college. My father was a machinist. My mother was a hairdresser. And they're like, why don't you want to work at the grocery store? I was working 12 to 8 and I was making, back then, this was in the 70s, $9-10 an hour. You too could graduate to be the store manager someday. Why would you want to go to college? And why would you want to borrow to go to college?
Yeah. It's exactly, and it isn't, it's just, their world, they aren't being evil. Their world, they see the world as being,
yeah, that was,
it was their world. And their frame is that. And,
yeah. So I wanted to, if I could take that a little bit further on, like I said, you've been teaching over a half century and you're a bit of a legend on campus at the university. I'm just curious, as you look at the business landscape, what's changed over the years? And then what's kind of remained the same? Because you've seen, listen, the average company spent, average length, I think time but the company stays healthy is usually 7-8 years. The Fortune 500 list, Fortune 20 list changes pretty routinely now in terms of companies coming off and on. And not many stand the test of time. So what's changed? What stayed the same for you?
What if you're asking about the business landscape, of kind of an outside observer of it and watching it, I think what's changed over time and probably continues to change is many things count, but what bubbles to the top and is most important has changed enormously over the 50 years. When I first started teaching, we spent a lot of time talking about acquiring assets. And that was in the late 70s and so forth. And throughout the 70s, and the winner was the person who had the most assets, or now we call it resources. But then somewhere in the 80s, it kind of like knowledge started replacing assets as the most important thing for a company to have. I'd rather know the price of a barrel of oil than own a barrel of oil, because I can take advantage of my knowledge. But then in the last 5-10 years or so, I think it's connections that count. That if you watch the companies they're now bubbling to the top, don't really have particular resources or real special knowledge, but they connect people. Places like LinkedIn and Facebook, they connect people, and we value those connections. And that's quite different over the 50 years if you think about that.
Yeah.
So all those things still count, but what's bubbled up right now are that connections may be more valuable than knowledge.
Yeah. And I guess that's why the NASDAQ has such a nice rise over the last, certainly the last 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, because it's those companies that do the connections that have driven that value up.
Indeed. Let me double click on that. And again, some companies, I remember Built the Last years ago, that book that Collins wrote around, he took 20 different industries. He took the number 1 and number 2 player and contrasted why one stood the test of time and one faded away.
Yeah.
What do you think those differentials are between those companies that through all the social economic upheaval, consumer changes and taste, they still stand true and tall, and others kind of wither and disappear and get bankrupt? What's the big difference there in your mind?
I'm going to answer 2, but boy, be careful. That's just my mind. One would be the ability to adapt, because like Collins, and remember that book way back in the early 80s called In Search of Excellence?
Right, Tom Peters' book.
Yeah, Tom Peters' book. But then something like within 10 years, more than half those companies were gone, or were not doing as well. So one aspect of it certainly is adaptation, that ability to adapt. And the problem is that when you're successful, you'll tend to stay with what makes you successful and not make that adaptation. It's hard to give up what works.
Yeah.
The other book the other book that Collins did that wasn't, and I'm not sure I could recall the title for you quickly, but he did a book about why companies aren't successful or why they fail. And he went back into his data and looked again. And the number 1 leader of failure was arrogance on the part of the top management. So and I thought that was if I could find that title for you if you like, but that was a really, really good book. And it was kind of the flip side of the same man who said, here's what it takes to be good to great. Here's what will kill you.
Yeah.
And the number 1, arrogance among the leaders.
Yeah, we had a professor from Stanford. I don't know if you run across him, Tony Seba, S-E-B-A, from Stanford.
Yeah.
He came in and talked to us a couple times now over the last year, our management team. And his theory was, and it was pretty compelling, is that companies get wedded to a particular technology. They invest in it both economically and psychologically. It's hard for them to pull away from it, even though they know they need to. And he starts his presentation with a picture of New York City near the Flatiron Building with, I think it's 1923. The question he has is pick out the horse and buggy, pick out the car that's in a sea of horse and buggies. A year and a half later, same picture. Now pick out the reverse, the horse and buggy within the sea of cars.
Yeah.
And he was telling us any company that has motor in the front of it or in the back of it, motor car company or Ford Motor or General Motors, they're going to be gone because they won't be able to shift fast enough to the declining, cost of owning an EV.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can see the companies are trying to do that. They're all reporting right now that they're going in that direction, but it's kind of like the airlines trying to adapt when Southwest first came. They just couldn't get that low rate model because they had so many costs built in, and their model was kind of that expensive service.
Yeah. And just taking it a bit further, Ron, I had Paul Pullman on this little webcast a couple of weeks ago, and Paul he's probably the noted voice in the voice in the business community around doing good by doing business well, giving back to society. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive to the profit orientation, which I think was a radical concept 10 years ago, but I think more companies are now taking that on as truth. What's your view of what role business should play in society?
You know,
how's that for a good one to get rolling here?
I think I think what you see is that business has got. I think we're undergoing in terms of what we were just talking about before about businesses change. I think also how society views business and how business views society have to be changing simultaneously. The truth is, the businesses we can't afford to let the businesses just take from society, but society has to also enable the business too. That there's going to, all that recent stuff of the conference board about, that we can't just be shareholder driven totally by shareholders.
Yeah.
I mean, I think those are really, really important discussions, and we've got to have those, and business has got to figure out its obligation or its partnership. Obligation isn't the right word. It's partnership with society, because it can't just be driven by shareholders, because the only shareholder who owns the company nowadays is really a computer. And therefore, if we're doing what's best for the shareholder, we're doing what's best for that day trading computer, not for the, and the computer doesn't want it. It doesn't really care. Yeah, I just finished doing a seminar last night for a group in the Tanzanian government. And I was amazed. I asked them to do a presentation, a fictional presentation, if they were seeing the president of Tanzania, what would they ask him? They could do one thing to ask for. What would they try and get him to do? And a lot of it was, a lot of the responses of the people was, please help the businesses to help us. That they see in a developing country, we aren't going to develop without business, but business can't just take from the country either. And so there's this partnership that I'm not smart enough to figure out, but I have the feeling there are people out there in business and government who are smart enough to figure that out, and we need to build that partnership.
In fact, not to dwell too much on Paul, but what he told me, since he's now stepped down and retired from Unilever after 10 years of terrific leadership, he co-founded this company called Imagine, and it's a collective of companies across different industries that are banding together to force and enable change. Basically, the numbers, critical mass companies going at a particular issue to get traction. And what do you see on from the student? What are the issues they're concerned about as young people in your classroom, and how has that changed over the last little while since you've been teaching?
Wow.
Other than is Alabama going to win another national championship? Set that aside. I know that's a common.
We'll put that aside.
Yeah. The answer is yes.
I think that what I see in the students, the change, we all complain, and I seriously single-handedly trying to combat the notion of grade inflation. But I'm doing my best. But the truth is, the grades have gone up partially they are inflated, partially the students are so good and so driven. And the change that I've seen 25, 30 years ago, students thought a really high grade point average was sufficient to make that next step to business. What they now understand, and they seem to, and they practice us, is that you need more than that. So their extracurricular activities, their work experience, their summer internships are probably, in our MBA program, probably our single most competitive program to become a part of is our case team, because we've developed a really good case team that competes against other schools, and the students see that as a real learning opportunity. There's no grade in there, but so what the students are doing is they're no longer, they are grade focused, but they kind of, that's like the entry. And now and for me to impress you as employer, I've got to have that grade point average, and I have to have experiences A, B, C, and D. And they go out of their way to grab those experiences. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, it is. I want to ask you something that's related to that, Ron. I was on the phone yesterday with the dean of my undergrad university, SUNY Oswego, PK, and he's going through a revitalization of the curriculum. He was asking me, MBA curriculum. He's asking me, what should we be teaching? And I said, you ought to be teaching quants, a little bit less and more qualitative. And I had the CEO of Logitech with me, really good guy, Bracken Darrow. And he told me, he says, I don't hire any MBAs unless they've had an undergraduate in social sciences. Because I want people that are smart, obviously, but I want somebody that actually is interested in the world and solving the world's problem. Those two worlds are not mutually exclusive. So when you look at your curriculum, the strengths and weaknesses of a student coming out, what do you see?
I'm going to just parrot what you just said. I think it's amazing to me that businesses say what we need are creativity and innovation. And then what we do is we say, okay, so we're going to give you all analytical skills and accounting. Now be creative. Yeah. I mean, we sort out the kid who's going to, to be that. My TA this semester, my teaching assistant this semester has an undergraduate in theater, and but now is specializing in data analytics. And to me, that's the perfect combination. He has really good interpersonal skills, has knowledge of the liberal arts through his theater background, but boy, can that kid crunch a number too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He is he's a full player, and I think that's what the students want. That's what business needs, and that's what the students should try and be.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Ron, I'm gonna come back to the students a little bit later on and your classroom work. I wanted to go in a different direction now, because you are really an unusual worldly guy, spending a lot of time on the road. You bought a house several years ago in the bush of South Africa. Sight unseen, I believe, and I understand. Tell us about that, and tell us about the experience of, I think you guys spend, you and your wife, a couple months a year out in the bush in this house in South Africa. Tell me about that.
It was I had been in administration for 17 years. The other appeal of academics, and it turns out it's kind of a fraud, is that notion of having your summers off. And the truth is your summers get pretty busy. And so that never happened. And then I finally, as I went into the tail end of my career, said, I'm going to make it happen. And so my wife and I finally said, we're going to have 2 months a year kind of free. I'll still work during that time, but we can go wherever. And we debated buying a condo in Florida, and we ended up buying a bush house in South Africa. It borders a park called Kruger National Park, and it does not have electricity. We use solar power. It's in an isolated location, and it is the most fun I've ever had in my life. I mean, it is absolutely fascinating. It's probably, well, I thought it was going to be a vacation. It's probably increased my productivity because I have, the interruptions are gone. There's no internet, no cell phones or anything like that. Earlier this morning, we have our house is located in they have these packets that you can buy. They're kind of like areas of land where houses are. So there are other houses in the area, but you can't see them. But earlier this morning, the manager of the area called or sent me an email to say that a Cape buffalo had broken the fence, and they tried to get him out with a helicopter from Kruger National Park. And he said that old thing wouldn't move. And he said, I'm really sorry, but in your yard, we had to kill him. Oh, wow. So they shot a Cape buffalo in my backyard this morning. Wow. I mean, those are pretty unique. no offense, and I say it with humility, but not many people can say, yeah, this morning I had a Cape buffalo killed in my backyard. You know?
Sounds a lot more exciting than owning a condo in someplace in Clearwater, right?
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to owning a condo in Clearwater.
Yeah.
But for me, I didn't want to. I use the metaphor of squeeze the juice. I want to, and I talk to my students about that all the time, about getting the most out of everything, whether it's your education, your experience, or in my case now, my old age.
Mhm.
And I want to kind of squeeze the juice out of my last years and get what I can, as long as I can.
Yeah.
And buying this house was an attempt to squeeze the juice.
And I noted, and I've read your book. You've got a recent book you author, which is Sitting with Elephants. It's all about over time building trust with and ability to interact and then sit with elephants. So it's a bit of a metaphor, at least I took away a bit of a metaphor for life among humans. Can you talk to us, our viewing audience around the globe about that? What kind of compelled you to write the book? What the lessons are and what the translation of that experience is into our daily lives as humans?
Yeah, I didn't start out to write the book. I started out writing my children emails about what was happening, and then they started getting kind of reflective. And my daughter-in-law suggested, she said, you really have a book here. And what I discovered in the experience, I started really now it's been about 7 or 8 years ago, elephants come up to our back fence, and I started trying to go close to them, but they would do what's called a mock charge, and I run away screaming like a little girl. And asked some safari guides in the area how to do this approach, and they taught me, and they said the essence of it is humility. They said that you have to be humble, and humility will allow you to get into the presence of not just the elephants but many African animals. And what these guides taught me is they said you both have to be of a humble heart, but also the appearance of humility. They said, whatever you do, don't stare at the elephants, because predators stare. And they said, if you want to get close to most African animals, then don't stare at them, because they will instantly read that as a predator, and they will either move aggressively toward you or walk away. The only animals that you can stare at ultimately, or that you need to, and maybe there is a metaphor here on both sides, that humility is really good unless you're close to like a lion or a leopard. And what you do, I go for daily walks, and we occasionally have lions in our area because they break in through the fence. We always have leopards because they can jump the fence. And if you're instructed that if you encounter a leopard, I take along a walking stick. And if you encounter a leopard, what you do is you hold the stick above your head and you try and look really, really big, because that leopard is kind of sizing you up and making a decision. Everything else you can be humble with. Then there might be some interesting metaphors there of be humble 90% of the time, but 10% of the time, raise your stick and look tough.
And so how did you go, again, as I remember reading your book, Ron, it took you quite a while to get accepted.
5 years.
Yeah, which took a lot of patience, and obviously that's intermixed between 10-month breaks here and there.
Right, exactly, yes.
So what was the path, what was the trick to build that sense of humility? How did you demonstrate it with your elephants? And also I want to move to what's the application in the classroom, and what's the application to lessons in life?
I think what happens, and at first you try and feign humility, and then you start realizing the more you look and the more you encounter the elephants, and the more, in my case, I read about them, they really are pretty superior to me, And at some point, it was no longer pretending to be humble. It was, you're a magnificent animal. You communicate in multiple ways. you're loving, you know, you're generally kind unless threatened. And so the initial thing was that I don't, you know, there's a lot of recent articles about whether or not you need to be authentic, and whether, you know, the humility has to be authentic, I think. I don't think you really fake that. And once I got to that, it starts, once you realize that the elephants are generally perhaps better than we are in some ways, you start seeing that in other people. I started, I mean, it became kind of I became just spending a lot of time thinking about how important humility is to a variety of different capacities. And if I'm humble, I'm not sure in a business sense I can listen if I'm not humble. I'm not sure in an academic sense. If a student comes to me and I instantly know the answer, that's not humility, and that's a bit arrogant to impose that answer on it. You know, so I think it's helped me try to learn to be a better listener, and try to ultimately kind of to be a better person. That I've tried not to be as self-centered as I historically, or by unintention, sometimes I am. And
you know, for me, it's kind of interesting because what we were trained early in our life was, at least my life, your leadership was taking the hill, always having a point of view, being the first in line. You know, team play was okay, but you know, winning was better.
yeah,
And yet, what I think today in our network society and our relatively flat organizations, leaders that can bring people together
yes,
through this medium or through geographic restrictions, you know, around the world, are people that listen well and they're actually very humble. I worked for John Bryan at Kellogg for 4 years, and John was an introvert as a CEO, but he was good in front of people. He just didn't like to
yeah,
do that. But what really made him really stand out was his extreme humility.
yeah,
He listened well, he was thoughtful, and as a result, people were drawn to him, not because he had this big oratorical power, but he
yeah,
demonstrated humility.
yeah, yeah. It, you know, and really, if you think of some of the great religious leaders and the great leaders of the world, a lot of them, you know, Mandela was humble, Gandhi was humble. I mean, you know, Jesus, Buddha, all of those people, they they're very they become very successful with that ability of not needing to be the kind of the center of attention.
So how do you, I'm just curious, how do you bring all that into the classroom? How do you take that experience of sitting with elephants, the 5-year journey of winning their trust, being humble, being accepted, into the classroom? I suspect you must teach leadership and communication through that lens.
I,
So I'm just
I,
curious how you do that now that
yeah,
you've got that experience.
it's very strange, and I'd like to tell you how it works, but I can't figure it out.
Hmm.
But what I do in my seminars and in my classroom is the first day I give that, I put together this presentation of how to sit with an elephant, and I start the class off with that, with and stress this need for humility, and it seems to set the right tone in the classroom, because I think it opens, it seems to open up the seminar and the classroom to people saying, he will listen to me. And then I try to exercise and do that. So it increases participation enormously, by starting with that. And then we'll just continue to repeat it as the discussions and as the class goes along. But yeah, it drives through it because it's the first thing that we start with. It's the first thing that we start with.
That's terrific. And you know, I know the listeners won't know this, but I do, from having been on campus for the last 40 years and being a student there. Never had you as a faculty member, but certainly I've known you for a long time now and a good friend. You've been recognized a lot at the university as if not the best university teacher, one of them. Just to be not humble for a moment, but that's your reputation. Um, why is that, first of all? And then secondly, what constitutes a great teacher? And I'm not talking necessarily great teacher academic, but just a great teacher in life. You may be a business person, you may be a member of clergy, you may be an academician. What's the element that underscores that? You mentioned one, which is being open to learning.
Yeah.
What's the other factors that drive great teachers that make a difference?
I think it's probably loving people, liking people. I enjoy I like to be in the presence of my students. I enjoy them. I think whether it's a classroom or a business meeting, the notion of respecting other people's ideas and maybe treating them with dignity, and recognizing that that the value of and I spent 17 years as department head, and during that time, early in that time, I came to the realization. I was kind of just reflecting, and I realized that the quality, like, I wanted the department to be good, but I decided it could only be as good as the faculty who were in the department. And that as the head of the department, my responsibility was to make sure they had all the resources and so forth, but also that their life had kind of meaning, and that I recognized the meaning of their life and of their personal obligations, and that if they were content, they would pass that on to the students. And I suspect the same thing goes on to every company, that the top management doesn't often have that direct contact with that customer. But if you're at L'Oreal, that woman at that counter, that counter saleswoman is where that, and if she feels dignity from on top, I'll bet she passes that on to the customer in a way that is almost immeasurable, but invaluable to a L'Oreal or whatever the company is. And I know you were in charge of Procter & Gamble's, so I shouldn't have said L'Oreal. I should have said Procter & Gamble's Health and Beauty. I apologize.
Listen, L'Oreal's an okay company.
Okay, can I tell a story? Can I tell a story on here about Dennis?
No.
Come on.
No, you cannot. This is a one-way. This is my webcast, Dulek.
Do you know the story I want to tell, don't you, or not?
No. Go ahead. I can edit this later.
You can edit this later, but I will never, ever forget when I was asked to introduce you to the CEO of L'Oreal Korea was here, and I was told to introduce at a meeting to introduce the two of you, and he came. I introduced the two of you, and he looked at you, and he said, "You are a very fierce competitor. I respect you." And your response was, "Everything we've learned by studying you." Mm-hmm. Man, that was classy.
Yeah, that was. They were and are the standard bearer for beauty. They really are. They're a fantastic company, and how they onboard people, and you learn about society, fashion, wine, style before you enter into any leadership role. It's quite a company. But
it showed the dignity that right there between the two of you, though, too.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I won't trim that out. I like that.
Okay, fair enough.
Hey, I did want to, it's a nice little segue to your consulting career, where you've done a lot of consulting with many, many different companies. And obviously part of your specialism in academia is business writing, business education, communication. When you get inside these companies, you mentioned about really good leaders are able to be authentic, humble, transfer that dignity to others in the organization, particularly down the line where it really counts at the patient level, the customer level. Are there other things that really good leaders do that differentiate themselves from those that are not?
Probably, it would probably be another version of what we've talked about. I think that they're open to change, and they probably adjust. And ultimately, they build an organization based on trust, and they the people in Tanzania just asked me a question about what makes a really great leader, and they posed it in a way of communication. My answer was, from what I've seen, is that they said, is it a person who's hard or a person who's soft? And my answer is, I think it could be either one, but but the really great leaders I've seen always have my back, that I know they're going to work, they're going to do what's best for the company, but also what's best for me. And so that notion of kind of developing trust, with the old metaphor about that I've got your back, that I'll do what's best for the University of Alabama, but I'm going to do what's best for you too. And hopefully I can usually have those two things be aligned. And in most instances, I think they are.
Yeah, and let me, Ron, if I could take that a bit further into back to your classroom for a minute. You've taught 3 generations of students through several decades now. I'm assuming that the average student today has a low level of trust in institutions, just by nature of what's happened over the last 15, 20 years, at least during their time they were being imprinted as young people, right?
Yes.
How do you get them to retrust some of the things that you and I might have taken for granted in our upbringing and our professional careers? How do you get them to unlearn what they might have experienced and renew their trust in institutions, their leaders? How do you do that? Or is that an issue? Maybe I'm overreading it.
No, I think it is. I think it is an issue, but I don't know how you get it, other than the only thing that creates trust is consistent is consistent behavior, and boy, we've got to work on that in terms of that. There's a new book that was just published. Malcolm Gladwell picked it up in a book called Talking to Strangers, which is an excellent book. And he used this other book called Duped by a guy named Levine, who's actually is a professor at UAB. And what Levine talks about is that we have a natural inclination to want to trust. That it's based a little bit on there's a great Harvard Business Review article about the neuroscience of trust, and that we want to trust people because it makes us feel good, because we produce oxytocin. And so I think the answer is, if we get consistent behavior, not lack of integrity, that probably that because we want to trust, it'll come back, but it's not going to be rapid, because once it's violated, it takes a long time to get it back.
Yeah.
But we really do want it. I want to trust a company. I remember many years ago, IBM. I did a lot of consulting with IBM, and this one man told me, he said, I asked him, does IBM cheat? And his answer was no, because A, it's not in our culture, and B, because we're so large, we could never make enough money cheating anyway. Why would you risk the entire reputation of an organization? And he said that, and that it made me really proud to even be associated as a consultant with IBM because of that.
Yeah, it's remarkable to me, Ron. If I go back to the Tylenol tampering back 20 some years ago with Johnson & Johnson, and what they did, what guided their behavior which was their credo, which back to the 1930s. I think about P&G, where I worked, going back to the 1830s. Kellogg, similarly back to the 1900s. Same for Disney. They all had very strong cultures in that if you carried the badge, whether it was Johnson & Johnson, P&G, Kellogg, Disney, where I worked, you could literally expect the same sort of behavior. from people that you might not have met on the other side of the world because you came through that same value set
Yeah.
that attracted you to your company and got reinforced.
Yeah.
Do you see students yearning for that in terms of, do they make selection decisions, I guess is the question, based on that? Or is it still, hey, whoever pays me the most money, that's where I'm going?
The answer is it depends.
It depends.
But I'd say a number of more students than in the past are choosing that. What I'm not sure I would say where I see it is not in the initial hire, because the students are often scared.
Yeah.
Where I see it is the callback that I get from students who are out 3, 4, 5 years, and they say, I don't see a purpose in what I'm doing here, so I'm starting to look. And they want both the culture and they want to see a purpose to their work. And I think that becomes a really important thing for leaders to do, to sell them not just on how they're benefiting, but that their work has some kind of meaning.
Yeah, it's meaning.
Yeah, but I don't see that as much as the initial hire. I see that, and I'm just amazed. And I won't name some. There's 2 companies that I see they hire our best students and they lose them in 3 years. And it isn't. They're not like a consulting company that wants to lose them, but they're losing them because the students feel that the job is meaningless.
Yeah.
And that falls on top management, because the company performs a valid function, and top management needs to reinforce that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by that. I've studied this a lot. I tried to apply it best I can in my own career, where if you can create a connection to the broader ambition of the organization or the business you're leading and drop it down into meaningful bite-sized chunks, I would say, into what that means at the front line.
Yes.
And you can trace it all the way back up.
Mm-hmm.
To a guy that's packing soap in a factory. He knows why he's doing that vis-a-vis the purpose, as opposed to I'm just putting crap in a box and shipping it. You've got a pretty good organization. Chances are you're going to be outperforming your competition.
Yes.
Chances are it's going to be a better work environment that will retain these young people.
Right. It's just amazing on that.
And just keeping that forward, again, back to the generation of students, how have they changed? Again, you've got this longitudinal pathway that most people don't, with 5 decades plus of teaching, and you're still highly relevant because you're still winning all these awards for teaching, which is fantastic, incidentally. But how have they changed? How have they remained the same?
I think they've changed it, in all honesty, and I'm a cockeyed optimist. I think they work harder than ever, and they really are focused on what they're doing. Now realize I only teach at the graduate level and senior level, so there are kids who don't make it to that level, and I can't comment on them. But by the time they're seniors at almost any university, they realize that they are going to be having to go into a competitive environment, and they need a skill set that's useful. And they seem to go out of their way. They seem to be picking courses that are developing skill. Now you could argue that they're a little bit too quantitative here, but they're picking courses that the business world seems to want. And when that's quantitative, they're going in that direction. And so they're pragmatic, they're hardworking, they're well-meaning. I find students just delightful. They are, and it hasn't changed in that they're still 21. They're still trying to figure out how to break out from mom and dad while not wanting to break out from mom and dad. They're still 21 is still
21.
21.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so really neat.
Yeah, I grant you that. And if we knew what we knew back then, we might be a little bit different today. if I could transport my 30 years of experience back into my 20-year-old body, I'd be a different person, but we don't
Yes.
have that
You,
foresight.
I once, when my father had cancer, I went up and was taking care of him, and I was in my early 30s, but I had, and and he was in his near the end of his time, and we both knew it. And I asked him the question, if you could do it again, would you do it? And
Mhm.
his answer was, if I knew what I know now and did it again, yes, but I might not be so lucky next time. And I always thought that was a really interesting. He said, "Boy," he said, "you really, he said, when you start out, you don't know anything, and he said, you better hope you're kind of lucky."
Yeah.
And he regarded himself as being fortunate or lucky.
Well, just to build on that, I remember at Alabama as a poor kid, again, I'm coming down from upstate New York to go to grad
Uh-huh.
school, and Al Spritzer, you remember Al?
I remember Al really
He,
well.
he took pity on me because I had no money. He'd take me to dinner twice a week
Uh-huh.
before the labor law class. And he was also the guy that recommended me for my first job. He's actually is the guy that started me out. And that
Uh-huh.
was happenstance. That was, I don't know if
Yeah.
it was luck, but it was also a teacher that looked out and wanted to build and help students.
Yeah.
It made a difference, at least in my life, as I was coming out of the
Yeah.
university.
Yeah. And that's what, to me, that's where the value is in this job.
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to ask you about, and it's really appropriate because you do the last lecture. Tell me about that. There's a tradition of the last lecture that you're honored to teach. Tell us about that.
But they started this program about 10 years ago, and the students, it's a purely student-based project. The university oversees it, but the question for the students is, if this was your last lecture in college, who would you want to deliver that? And then they ask them to deliver that. And I, through a variety of accidental things, I wound up giving the first one, and it was really fun. We're still doing it, but every year it's somewhat different, because so I now go there and just stand up, and because I was the last lecture. The over the years, the people have approached it in different ways. Some people have taught it of here's my favorite kind of, like, one person did his favorite song was American Pie, and he did an interpretation of that. I personally,
I'm gonna have that in my head all day now. That
bye bye. Go to the levee, Chevy to the levee. And no, I can't get it out of my head. I chose to put it together in terms of what I would really tell the students, that if it was my very last lecture, what I would, and what I chose to tell them, I used the metaphor of don't let the stone stick between your toes. And that being that, things go wrong at a university, in life. And if you continue to focus on that, those events will ultimately own you. So what you really want to do is, whether you get a bad break in a business setting or an academic setting, don't let that course that you didn't like become your focus for the university. Because if you do that, we'll own you. And don't let us own you like that. Let us own you in a positive way of whatever that positive experience was. And so the last lecture was a really humbling experience. When I got there, initially I was told that we would do it at the library in front of 20 people, and we wound up doing it in front of 400 people.
Wow.
And scary. I'm glad that I didn't know that in advance. It would have scared the bejeepers out of me. But it was really fun. And most of them are done with here's what I would tell a student if this was the last time I talked to them.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it's becoming a tradition at the university now. And I haven't seen other universities do it. I suspect they may have some version of it, but I know
Carnegie Mellon did it and they were the first to do it. And there was a guy named Randy Pausch who wrote a book about that. And I think it's entitled The Last Lecture.
Yeah.
And we started it just about the same time as they did it at Carnegie Mellon.
Well, quite an honor for you to be selected for the first time across the entire university. I mean, that's That's tall cotton, as you would say down in Alabama.
I think it's blind luck. It helps to teach a lot of courses and a lot of students, by the
Yeah,
way.
repetition helps.
Yeah, repetition helps.
Ron, I had one last question for you, and that is, this is really a hard one. This, for the listeners, I'm going to apologize in the front end because you may not be Alabama grads or disciples of Alabama football, but how many national championships is Nick Saban going to have before he hangs it up, Ron?
What's his term? That's rat poison that you're asking me there, Dennis.
That's rat poison.
Rat poison.
Yeah, otherwise known as trust the process.
Yeah, he doesn't care, I don't think, as long as he can do the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Nick Saban, I've met him, but no way do I say I know him, but I think he is the epitome of a great teacher.
Yeah.
And you see that he teaches players, but you can tell his, I had the starting center, Landon Dickerson, in class this semester.
Yeah.
And Dickerson's affection for Saban was unmistakable.
Yeah.
And if you watch the national championship game, you saw that he carried him off. He went over and carried him off the field.
Yeah.
And
that was neat. That was neat. That was special. That was unique.
Yeah, and that's the kind. I guess as a CEO, maybe that's the affection you want. You want your frontline employees to pick you up as you at your retirement, as you step down and carry you out of the building.
I haven't seen that yet, Ron, in my life, but I have seen deep, abiding affection, maybe not adulation, but affection for CEOs that have been true to the compass setting they set for their organizations, were completely authentic, listened well, and got the best out of people. Those are the great leaders, and
those are the great
similar to what I think the coach at Alabama does in many ways.
Yeah.
So what do you do with your students as well, my friend?
Well, I'll try. I try.
Well, Ron, I appreciate you joining us today on Wendepunkt. It's always a pleasure. I think I'll see you, I hope, in a few weeks down at the board meeting, but a real pleasure to get on the horn with you today and kick around these ideas a bit.
I've been honored, Dennis, and thank you. And thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for your friendship.
All right. Thank you, sir. Well,
thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, that was a great interview with Ron Dulek, good friend of mine, a little bit off the beaten path. We're usually talking to business leaders, but I thought it would be important and a little change of pace to talk about a leader in academia that's actually shaping the lives of young people who eventually make their way into global businesses. And given he's been at it now 5 decades, there's several hundreds and thousands of students that he's touched that are now in critical roles within companies across the globe. So I thought it would be interesting for you to listen to his story. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another edition of Wendepunkt, Inflection Points for Senior Leaders. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the good folks at Kinetic Consulting for underwriting this webcast. This is Dennis Schuler, your host of Wendepunkt, wishing you good health and happiness, and see you down the road in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much.